Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Snap No Tap podcast. I am Joe Cardinal. Tony Cecchine is not able to join us this episode. He's having internet problems, but he insisted we go ahead without him. So I'm going to fill in his shoes as far as doing our opening monologue. This is normally the part in the show where he comments on how good I look accurately, but I will just note that was taking place for the record. Also, this is where we plug our products. Of course, Tony in the city, teaches a workshop at Jason Bender's Martial Arts and Fitness, and then out at the Western Burbs at DuPage Krav Maga. We will have links below if you are looking at this on YouTube, so to keep updated on that. Also, check Tony's website, catchwrestle.com, for updates on that. If you can't make those workshops, first let me recommend, if you can train with Tony in person, that's the way to go. The best way to learn these moves are to feel them put on by Tony. You can learn them from video, but you are missing a piece of it. So I encourage anybody who can travel and make it. If you can't make it to the workshops, definitely have a time to come out and hang with Tony. He makes it very informal. You can come with the training partner. And besides the training opportunities in person, it's great just to hang out with him and hear his stories. If you've been listening to the podcast, you understand what we mean. That's kind of why we put this podcast together, to kind of capture some of his stories, at least partially, but also to talk with interesting people, which we'll be getting to. And then, of course, if you can't swing that, think about downloading some videos, buying videos from Tony's website. That always helps. And of course, there's our monthly membership, which I said, again, links will be below. If you want to support the podcast, you like what we're doing, you like the coach, it really helps keep supporting him doing what he's doing. So without that, like I said, without Tony here, we're going to jump right into our guest, Professor James Donahue. I'm really excited to have him on the show. We obviously are a martial arts centric podcast, but we have people from all different backgrounds necessarily at this point. We enjoy talking to people who are experts in any field, or just people that we enjoy hanging out with. And I think in this case, I think it's both, honestly. I've really had the pleasure to meet Professor Donahue. I took a class with him this past spring semester at the College of DuPage. And I want to give a shout out to College of DuPage too. So I moved out to the Western Burbs in 2003 from the city. And one of the reasons why I stay out there is the College of DuPage. It's a great resource for anybody who's in the Western Burbs and wants to either, start their education or continue their education. I've just come across all kinds of great teachers there, all kinds of great curriculum. It's really at a high standard. And I've considered moving back into the city to be closer to my kids maybe, but then one of the things I realized I'd be giving up, or I'd have to pay more, is going to College of DuPage, and that is definitely something in my calculus. So if you're out in the Western Burbs, I just want to give it a ringing endorsement. And as you'll find out as we talk to the professor here, you'll see why I really am a big advocate of that school. But yeah, so I took an anatomy and physiology course with the professor, and it was really one of the best classes I've ever taken. I think just in general, I think everybody should take anatomy and physiology. I think it's one of those classes that unfortunately is not required, but I kind of think of it as like an owner's manual. Like everybody should be more familiar with their body and how it operates. I think we make a lot of assumptions based on kind of hearsay. And one of the things I enjoyed about the class is that things would come up and you're like, oh, wait, our blood isn't really blue when it returns back to, when it's not oxygenated. There's all these little things I heard as a kid about the body, and you'd be surprised how many of those things stick with you. And you just, like I said, just vague misinformation that's out there about how the human body operates. And that is not a good way to run your life as far as how your body operates. And there's just a lot of things of crossover. Obviously, if a lot of the listeners out there are martial artists, knowing about health and how your body works, we're all fitness related. And You have to like follow the science. You want to know how your body actually works. If you're going to keep it healthy, keep it fit, and keep it safe. So, anyways, that was a long intro. Anyways, Professor, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. By the way, I think you look great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for endorsing it. So we have independent corroboration.
Exactly.
Now, I want to straighten out. I see on your name you have Jamie down. Is it all right if you want me to call you Jamie or as Professor? It's very.
That's fine with me. I was named after both grandfathers, James and John, but mom wanted an Irish nickname. So everyone who knows me calls me Jamie.
One of my favorite cousins is Jamie, so that'll be good. So maybe there's something to the name. Yeah, exactly. So thanks for making the time for coming on the show. I think people, one of the things I really appreciate at your class and kind of your approach to teaching is on the first lesson we had, the first class we had, you spent a good 20 or 30 minutes really just talking about yourself and giving an overview, and you really warmed up the class. And I think really kind of it really facilitated and encouraged conversation. That really opened up the class. Maybe people were talking too much, I think, afterwards, but that's probably a good problem to have in a classroom setting, because I feel a lot of times people are probably nervous or a little uncomfortable, and it's hard for them to open up and start engaging. And I think you did a great job of kind of breaking the ice with everybody. And that was the first thing right away I noticed. That was almost like a different approach. I mean, some teachers will do it to a small degree, or they'll talk about what their educational background is, but you're really open about talking about your life. And that's part of why I brought you on too. It's not just the subject matter expertise, but I think you have a really fascinating life that I think people will be interested to hear about. But anyways, on that note, so where did you grow up?
I'm an Army brat. So dad was in the military. And so my younger years, like through age 6, I grew up in Texas and South Carolina. We were on Army bases in Fort Sam Houston and Fort Jackson. And then when I was about turning 6, my mom was pregnant with my youngest brother, and we moved up here to Illinois. Pontiac, if you know where Pontiac is, spent maybe a year and a half in Pontiac. And then my parents in 74 bought a house in Morris, Illinois, and mom still lives there. Same house, still at the bottom of the hill, and spent most of my life, I guess, my young life in Illinois.
Illinois. And now your father was in the military, but was he a doctor? Is that right? Or
no, dad got his education through the military. So he was a CRNA, a certified registered nurse anesthetist. So no, he didn't get a doctor's degree. He did the same. He joked about this. Dad died a couple of years ago, but he joked that he would do the same exact job as the anesthesiologists and get paid 1/10 of what they got paid.
Yeah, that is well, I got to respect that job. That's one of those, yeah, that's so, you can't appreciate how the nuances. I imagine everybody's different, and every case you do, it's kind of like someone's life is on the line. And, if you get those anesthesias wrong, so that is an intense job. It
was kind of neat to have him as a resource, because when a question would come up that students would bring up, and hey, I heard that redheads need more anesthesia during a surgery, is that true? So I instead of looking it up, I'd talk to dad, and he'd be like, yeah, actually they do some research on that, and he'd give me a pathway to try to figure out why that was. So it was kind of neat to have him as a resource.
That's awesome. Yeah, that definitely have that heritage there, and have it in the family. Is that kind of what sparked your interest in the sciences?
Probably. Again, unbeknownst to anyone who lives in their own house, what you talk about around the dinner table is not what everyone else talks about. So dad would come home and we'd talk about the surgeries he saw that day, and that was normal for us. Then when I got married, I tried to have those same conversations. My wife's like, I don't want to talk about this while we're eating. Like, this is what we do around the dinner table. So yeah, it was brought up a lot. The hospital setting, dad working a lot, as you can imagine. He's gone by 6 in the morning. He doesn't get home until after 7 at night. And those were the conversations we had, because that's what he had just walked away from.
Yeah, my in-laws are all nurses, and so they are definitely free to talk about things that I think would turn most people off.
True.
And so, but it is nice to kind of just be able to open about and honest and accepting about, hey, this is what the body does, and this is what you need to do to take care of it, and this is what I see. So, in some ways, I think it's healthy to broach those things, especially with kids, and just have them, open about what their body does and what can happen.
Agreed.
So most of your like schooling was in Illinois. Um, at what point did you decide to say, "Hey, I think this is the path I want to go down"? Did you?
My path was a mess. As you brought up, I showed all my high school grades. Do you happen to recall what my high school grades were in science?
Uh, I don't remember they were that great.
They were not. I was a C student. I was dead average. I was not intrigued by school at all. I had no pathway. It was the expectation that we were going to go to college. I have an older sister, I have a younger brother. The expectation was that we were going to college, but neither of my parents had been to college. Again, dad got his education through the military.
Hmm.
And when mom started in nursing school, she got pregnant. So she had to drop out and she became a mom. And so the expectation was college, but there was no direction. And unfortunately, I didn't get a lot of direction from my high school counselors. And so when my sister, who was the first to go to college, went to Augustana, I kind of thought that's what you were supposed to do. I never visited a single college. Literally, my first day on campus was the first day we were dropped off for orientation. So you look at what kids do nowadays, and they visit different colleges around the entire nation. And I didn't get that. And whether it was my fault, whether it was my parents' fault, whether it was the counselor's fault, it was just we didn't know how to navigate that. So I ended up at Augustana simply because my sister went there.
It's interesting because I had a similar experience. Except that didn't work out as well for me.
Oh,
But yeah, when people don't really appreciate when when you don't have people in your support system, whether it's your immediate family who've been through the process. There's a lot of kind of things that if they haven't figured out the process, they don't know what to ask or do. My sister kind of figured it out on her own. She was driven to go to school, and I kind of remember after I graduated high school without a plan. Well, I kind of had a quasi plan, but that was unrealistic. Uh, but it was not school related. And my mom kind of turned to me and said, "So where are you going to college?" And I said, "What are you talking about? Like I didn't apply to anything. I didn't, I had no." She just assumed I was taking care of it. That because my sister did.
yep,
She hadn't gone and she didn't know the process. And my wife had a similar experience where her parents did not go to college, and she didn't even take her ACT or SAT. She didn't know that it wasn't required at that time, and so she didn't. So
yep.
she ended up taking it after high school, just because they said, "Where's your scores?" when she tried to get into school. And so it's a lot of things that people just kind of assume is common knowledge, and that happens in a lot of realms in life, whether it's education or financial education that kids don't get. If they don't have it at home, where are they going to get it?
Yep,
And yeah, so you ended up at Augustana.
I did with no direction. It seemed to me to be just a continuation of high school away from my parents. I didn't really have a major of any kind. Augustana is a liberal arts school, so you take a little bit of everything. So there was religion, there was sociology, there was science. I had to take a bowling class. I mean, it was a PE class, but you had to take something. So I took bowling. And so there was fulfill the requirements, but with no real goal in mind.
Mhm.
But at the end of my sophomore year, I had made a decision that, well, if I got to get a job someplace, I kind of want to do what my dad does because, well, I've got this resource. I've been kind of brought up in the hospital setting. And so I ended up going to nursing school down in Bloomington at Mennonite Community College, not community, Mennonite College of Nursing. And that didn't go the way I thought it was going to go. Literally, my first day on the hospital floor, I had a patient who had had a stroke. And so he was hemiplegic, and I was told to take care of him, make sure he can make it to the commode. And we're taught how to support people that are weak on one side. And so I followed all the instructions. This guy was a little on the heavy side. And I said, "Okay, you ready to go?" We counted to three, 1, 2, 3. He stood up and we both hit the ground. And because of his momentum, he ended up rolling underneath the bed. And so while I am trying to figure out what do I do next, one of the doctors walks in and just shakes his head and just, "I can't believe this," and walks out. And I'm like, "This is day one." This is, and I tell my students at this time, I'm on the floor at 6 o'clock. I don't get done until noon. Then I go to class until 6 o'clock. Then I work from 7 until midnight. I was delivering pizzas at Micheleo's and trying to figure out how in the world my body could do this at all. But I kept doing it over and over and over. And I discovered that this really wasn't what I wanted. I knew that I wanted to be in sciences, partially because I understood the sciences and I liked the sciences, but I didn't know what to do with it. And so my sister, actually, when I'm trying to figure out what to do next, she says, "Why don't you teach?" I said, "Okay." That was a discussion. That's it. That's why I teach.
So it was no grand calling, no clouds parting.
It was never, ever in my line of sight. Would have never considered teaching ever, considering my experience with education was not wonderful. I, well, okay, I did a lot of high school theater, so I knew how to get up on stage and how to act and how to put on a performance. I did a lot of music in high school, so getting on the stage was not an issue for me. But then it was the idea of learning all this material that, I thought I knew everything at age 18 and 19 and 20, and to discover how little you actually know, even at my age now, when I think I know a lot, I realize how little I actually know.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the theater connection. So that's kind of similar from my son. So he was a theater kid in high school. We have a really good theater program out by us, and he had aspirations of being a big movie star and whatnot. But he ended up through like a very like circuitous path finding education, and like you said, that connection there of being comfortable in front of people, and he did it, and he's doing it in Thailand where it wasn't even his like native language, so the kids and I just can't imagine standing in front of a group of rowdy kids in another country, but he was totally comfortable, just, yeah, I can do this and no problem. Now he's actually teaching, not only he's teaching English originally, but now he basically kind of is heading like a theater program out there. So like he's got all the kids acting and doing videos and things like that. And yeah, it's great. So it's kind of come full circle for him. But I guess my point being is that people underestimate underestimate the arts in general as far as its validity. But even theater, a lot of people are like, oh, that's a kind of, they assume they're just going to be an unemployed actor, someone who's going to be on the couch forever. But no, I mean, getting in front of people, whether you're in
Yep,
business, giving a presentation or teaching, I mean, there's all kinds of applications. It's a super important skill as far as being in front of people. And yeah, so that's awesome. Um, yeah, because I was also wondering, with the amount of time and effort you put in to learn the human body, obviously all kinds of directions you could have gone with that career wise. So it's interesting
sure.
to see that how and I was just thinking about it, like leading up to our talk about how, um, in some ways a lot of people think in terms of healthcare, and correctly so, is that it's a way of, not only are you learning these things and having a career, but you are helping people and contribute. I mean, that's the kind of the big part of the draw of the job. But education is very much like that too. It's another way of fulfilling that kind of giving back to society and kind of directly having an impact on people's lives and society as a whole. So it's kind of cool. It's another direction people really need to think about, I think, and it should be out there more often.
Agreed.
And yeah, and just supporting teachers in general. I mean, I think that's is given a lot of lip service, but I don't think enough, obviously, that teachers in general are undervalued in our society. So, and I was going to ask, you made an earlier comment about kind of, and now I guess you're on the opposite side. So you were a student and you had kind of a certain perspective of like when you went in right into college, you just felt like continuation of high school. And
Yep.
kind of as I'm an older student, so like I started back, I waited way too long to get back into school, after, oh man, I can't think of how long of a break where it's like, oh no, no, because I had my kind of career, I kind of fell into a career and was able to do on the job training and things like that. So formal education wasn't necessarily important. And now I really regret that I didn't just start earlier, just chipping away at it.
Sure.
But better late than never. But the one thing, I guess what's your observation on like as far as teaching those kids who just like go into college right out of high school and the maturity thing, and it seems like that could be kind of a negative working against them sometimes.
Working at the college, you oftentimes get these, kids right out of high school, excuse me, 18, 19-year olds, and they've had this pattern. They have an experience of how to learn. But now when you get these non-traditional students that are coming back and you see how much of the electronics are involved and navigating all of this through computers. I'm still a guy, I want to talk to a person face to face. I don't want to call somebody on a phone and do anything. I want to actually have a conversation with a person, not trying to navigate a computer. And it might be my generation, but You look at these kids nowadays and everything's electronic, and they're much better. They're much more savvy at navigating the electronics. If you get a non-traditional student, they may not be quite as savvy with that. And so you often have times, especially during COVID when everything was online, having to spend more time teaching them the electronic component of the class before you can even get to the content of the class.
Hmm.
So there is that component that we consider. And then there's also just the learning styles and how they used to learn. They used to all be, teacher was the sage on the stage. He stands up there, he tells you what you need to know, just regurgitate what he tells you to know. And now we've got more to that. We've got more than just the memorization. We've got the application of that information. And sometimes the non-traditional students that haven't learned in a formal education setting don't necessarily have that skill yet, or at least maybe that skill is rusty and it needs to be worked out. And by the time they work it out, they may not have scored well enough on the first couple of exams and they're trying to work their way back up. So there is some of that. And I try my best not to make any assumptions. I've had some non-traditional students who are rock stars, and I've had some 18, 19-year-olds who struggle. So it's never a one size fits all with education.
So yeah, I fit into the non-traditional category. Non-traditional. But the other thing that kind of, and it's interesting because your teaching career kind of spans all these changes in technology. So I was
Yeah.
kind of shocked when I went to the difference between my oldest son, the one who was in the theater, and my
Mhm.
youngest son, because my youngest son was in high school and smartphones had become ubiquitous. It was just everybody. And so it was just having like prior, even when my middle child's my daughter, they really didn't have to deal with kids just being on their phone all the time, like just having to deal with that. I couldn't imagine the obstacles or like the hurdles and the difficulties of. And now it's funny that even seems to be old news with that. So you've got things where basically, I mean, how do you I guess it just as a curiosity, how do you manage kids keeping them off of their devices? Or are you able to, or you just have to kind of accept that as part of what you're dealing with?
In my undergraduate, when I was in education classes, we were taught that teachers needed to change what they were doing every 7.5 minutes.
Hmm.
So if you were teaching for 7.5 minutes, you would take a break, you would do something else. Maybe it was a little more hands-on, maybe it was a video clip, maybe it was some images, but every 7.5 minutes. Do you know why?
Well, I'm sure it has something to do with the attention span, but is there some specifics?
Because every 7.5 minutes, TV went to commercial.
Oh, okay.
And that's when we would all run to the bathroom. And that's when we would all run upstairs and grab our drinks and our snacks and race back downstairs to make sure we didn't miss the beginning of Friends, because we couldn't pause like we can now. When you look at what today's kids are doing with technology, and the research backs this up pretty firmly, they can find anything. If they don't like it, swipe. If they don't like it, swipe. They can find something to engage them in a fraction of a second without having to pause for very long at all. So their attention spans have gone from 7.5 minutes to a matter of seconds. And so to keep them engaged in some way, to keep them off of their phones, you kind of have to put on a show. I mean, you have to be more interesting than the electronic device. And that sometimes can be very difficult in a topic that some students don't necessarily want to take. So you haven't mentioned that I actually, my major jobs, I teach high school. And so I teach these, ninth grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade kiddos. And this year I taught freshmen for the first time in a long time. And I was shocked because usually my upperclassmen, they're really good at staying off their phones. But these freshmen, it was an uphill battle with these kiddos. And the school tries to give us tools, create a bag so they can put their phones in the bag during class so that they can't access it, or make sure all phones are put away in their backpacks, all backpacks in the back of the room. These kids really struggle because that phone has become so much of the way their brain is wired. It's hard to be without it.
Yeah, it becomes like a phantom limb or something where they notice it's gone.
Waiting for that next buzz. When's the next buzz?
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys were allowed to just kind of have them put the phone somewhere else or collect them, because I just So my daughter did a semester abroad at like exchange things in Germany, and it was just a given. You give up your, can't remember if they all put them in a box or something, but it was like you did not have your device. And I remembered I was really surprised when that was not the case in my son's school. And the kids could just be kicking back, scrolling through their phone. I was like, man, if I had the temptation of YouTube or TikTok as a kid, I mean, I barely got an education as it was. I mean, I did okay. I was an okay student. I wasn't a complete slough, but man, I can't imagine the draw of that, because the TV was a distraction at home. But I can't imagine if I had access to video, anything, basically any content I wanted right in my palm of my hand. I probably would have, I don't know if I would have ever made it out of school. That's
Think about how
it's
many hours we played video games.
exactly. Yeah, if I could play it just handheld, with the quality. I always feel like I'm an old man complaining, yeah, kids these days with their phones. But the other thing now, have you come across, have you had to deal with any AI issues like people?
No,
No, that hasn't come up. So that's new on the
that hasn't come
horizon.
across my table yet. That I look forward to that. Let me tell you.
Yeah, it just keeps happening. Oh man. Um, yeah, that's the brave new world, almost literally. So scary. So one of the things it's kind of come up in passing. You mentioned the schools you went to were kind of religious schools. But did you grow up religious?
We had kind of a joke in my family that I was baptized Catholic and I was confirmed Lutheran. I didn't even realize how Lutheran I was because I didn't realize that there were two denominations of being Lutheran. So I was just, the church is the church. This is where you go. And then there was that split, like sometime in the early 80s, I think. And I found out that we were Missouri Synod Lutheran, and there was another branch called Evangelical Lutheran Churches. And so when I met the woman who became my wife, I discovered there were two churches because we both said, "Hey, we're Lutheran." And she's like, "Well, I am not the same kind of Lutheran as you." I'm like, "What does that mean?" So it was one of those, I was raised in the church. I didn't really understand the church. I can recite so many things about the church. And so coming out of high school and even going to a Lutheran school, it was kind of the same thing. It was, I go to church because you're supposed to go to church, and it wasn't really about the relationship of church.
Kind of like cultural church, kind of a
Yeah.
yeah. I grew up religion too. Grew up religion. I grew up Lutheran too. So, and I believe it was Missouri Synod. So we were the right kind of Lutherans, I think, is the way we like to put it. Uh,
Very much
uh,
more like Catholics than we'd like to believe sometimes.
yeah, that was the other thing I used to say is a Catholic light. It
Yep.
was very similar.
We just didn't have the calisthenics.
Um, but yeah, so I went through a phase, and might have talked this on previous episodes, but like my father passed away when I was young, and so my mom kind of went on a religious quest and became very evangelical. So I kind of was all over she went through all kinds of different denominations and variations of Christianity. So I got a broad spectrum of exposure to those. But definitely the beginning was Lutheran with the catechism and learning the Apostles' Creed and
Yep.
remembering all those little things. So it's a good starting point. It's very funny. And then you went to is Augustina Lutheran school?
Augustana is a private Lutheran
Augustana.
school, correct?
Okay, cool. And then, so at what point uh, did it transition for you from being kind of a cultural, educational aspect of your life to something more personal?
I used to joke about the fact that I'd go to different churches, and I did. I'd go to different churches of different denominations because I was usually trying to date a girl.
Yes,
It's true.
church is
It's
where you
true.
will go to meet them.
It's well, it's kind of a nice place to meet girls. But again, when I met my wife, it became a little more real. Her family is much more firm in their religion and relationship in that faith than my family was. And I think her family is wonderful. And so we got married in their church. So up in Northbrook, we got married at Gloria Day Lutheran Church and had a really good relationship with that church. We were living in Roselle at the time and driving to Northbrook on Sundays because my wife and I would sing in the praise team, and got into more conversations where it became more than just rote memorization. It became more than just attend and leave. You'd stick around for longer. You'd talk to the people. You started having these relationships, and it became more of a journey for me. And I think if I'm tracing it back right time wise, I got into a Bible study, and there's a long road here, but I took a group of kids to DC for a Christian weekend, a week out in DC, and met this guy by the name of Francis Chan. I didn't know who this guy was. And it turns out Francis Chan is a very famous religious author and pastor. And I'm just having conversations with this guy. I didn't know who he was. Like, he probably wondered why I didn't ask for his autograph. And got home, and everyone's like, "You met Francis Chan?" I'm like, "Yeah, who's Francis Chan?" And it turns out he's written all these books. And one of the first ones that became really big was one called Crazy Love. And a lot of people have done Bible studies on Crazy Love. And so I started looking up Francis Chan's sermons. And I found a series of sermons that Francis Chan did on Revelation. And I know that a lot of people really cringe about Revelation. And I'm like, well, okay, it is kind of scary, but there's got to be some promise in there that we can take away and say, well, why else would it be included in these biblical texts? And so he did, week by week, chapter by chapter, the entire book of Revelation. And so what I did is I printed out the NIV version of Revelation, which is what he was teaching from, and left myself space on the margins for notes. And I had my headphones in my break periods of teaching, and I would listen to a podcast of his preaching, and I would take notes. And the first time I went through this, I'm like, this is great. And the second time I went through it, I just kept adding more and more notes. And the third time I went through, I kept reading this thing and listening to this guy. And I'm like, there's more to this than just do the things you're supposed to do. It's not about being a good guy. It's not about being a good girl. There's more to it. And then, and you haven't brought this up yet, my family and I went to the Philippines to do missions work for a year in 2014. And I was asked to go to South Korea. And so I went to South Korea, and there was another guy that I met. His name was Wilkins, John Wilkins, I think. And he wrote this book that was about the history of Christ, not looking at Jesus as a preacher necessarily, but if he was who he said he was, can we prove it based on history? Can we find these places? Can we find the well where the woman touches his robe? Because they describe it really well in the Bible, but they'd never found it. It ended up they had to look a couple of feet that way to find it. And there it was. They find these things. So for me, and I know this isn't necessarily the right way to go about it, if there is a right way, but if you can prove it historically that all of these things did happen, that helps support my faith and add more credence to all these things that I've been learning throughout my lifetime. So it's an interesting answer, I think, to your question, but it kind of leads me to this guy of science who needs the facts, who's trying to believe in a faith of things that helps me reconcile with that.
Well, yeah, and I think that's kind of the natural question, and I'm probably sure the listeners are thinking about. Here's, you're very deep in the science, and throughout the class, you're always hammering it home to us, like, where's the data? Where's, is this pseudoscience? And trying to get us to discern, because there's so much quasi, information out there that's just, especially, like I said, when we have online information, there's all kinds of bad health advice coming out there about the body, and so you're very hard on, like, where's the data? What's the science? Is it from a reputable source? All these kind of things. And so someone who's a strong believer in science, and actually, I'll mention quite often you point out signs of evolution in the human body, and it's interesting because I was just talking to one of my in-laws who's very spiritual, and she did go a little cross-eyed when I was trying to describe your story in the perspective. It's like, oh no, evolution, absolutely. There's proof. We have hard evidence. Life evolves. Humans have evolved. And she's like, but he's religious, and I'm like, yes. And so I'm going to find out about that today. So how do you reconcile? And I don't mean to put you on the spot or whatever, but the 6 days of creation in the Bible versus what we know from other methods of aging the earth and the fossil record and things like that.
Well, I'll even call it an abbreviated depth into that. I have heard other teachers say that when reading Genesis, that it's more of an allegory. And to understand the Bible in its context and who could read the Bible, who could understand written speech, um, these things played a role in what is included in the Bible. So to look at the 6 days, is it 6 days? Is it six periods of time? Because people could understand days versus periods of time. I did read, and I don't know if I can really back this up. This comes from, again, my in-laws' church. This guy who did a study that proved mathematically that you could make 6 days equal thousands of years. And it has to do with physics. It has to do with Big Bang. It has to do with velocities and the speed of light. And I mean, like you said, use the word, make me kind of go a little cross-eyed because it's a little more physics than I'm used to. But it's very interesting that the idea of the Big Bang could somehow parallel what God did when he created everything.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think, and I don't know, for me, I've definitely come to a point where I don't take the Bible literally per se. And a lot of people, I think, if or want to or need to, it makes things easier in some ways. If you don't have to try and think about it in some kind of, higher way or abstract way, or where there's gray area for interpretation. But the reality is everybody's interpreting it. There's no, it's not even its original language. So there's already translation happening. But it is interesting, yeah, that some people have to cling to that. Like it's all or nothing, as far as like
Right.
it's either absolutely literally what it said or it's nothing, and there's no in between. But I think a lot of people, and I think we've talked about this briefly after class, is that I've met a lot of people who, or I've heard of people too, who, like, once they get involved in the sciences or they get into the medical field, they lose their faith because they, once they kind of see the hard evidence of evolution, they can't reconcile that. And it's unfortunate that they feel that they have to, I suppose, in my mind. That, but I understand it too. That if they've been told this is absolutely how it is, and I say, well, now I see concrete evidence to the contrary. It's hard to kind of do that. So it's always interesting to me when people live in both worlds and are trying to be objective about it, and honest about it. And how they still keep going forward. So, but it's interesting that it's kind of sounds almost like your educational path, that it wasn't like again, the sky parting analogy, or what I mentioned with
no.
your just deciding to teach. It's just kind of an organic process of it becoming more personal, because a lot of people have these salvation moments or whatever religion or outlook they have in life, or this or that event happened, and then boom, it clicks for them. But yours are just kind of gradual over time, making sense that this is what it is.
The more that I saw, the more that I experienced, the more that I learned, it just made sense. I've got one of my pastors said, he had this analogy about a blender. He said, if you had a blender and you broke it into 13 parts, just unscrewed it, took it apart 13 parts, and you put it into a bag and you shook it up and you dumped it out, how many times would it end up being a blender? And our brains just kind of went, what's this guy talking about? He's like, this is kind of what the theory of evolution is discussing, is that you have all the pieces, but how do all the pieces come together to form this thing that needs to function? I mean, if you want to go into an anatomical example, you could even talk about, silly concept here, but how does the sperm move? When you look at the tail, you look at the flagellum of a sperm, it takes a number of proteins to make that work so it can propel itself through the female reproductive tract to find the egg. If any one of those proteins is missing, it doesn't work. That sperm can't find the egg, creation doesn't happen. And yet all of them are there in the right place at the right time to create this outboard motor to propel this cell to create potentially another life. And does that happen just by accident, or does that happen by some kind of design? That's what I challenge my students to keep looking into. You have to make a decision. It has to be your decision whether you think it's done by dumb luck or design.
And what's weird to me is I mean, you can see and I guess there's examples of the human body where it's like, oh, that's just something that's left over, or it's just, it doesn't seem like there's like, why do men have nipples, let's say, to pick another odd, like, there's things, it's like, if you're intelligently designing it, there's like little flaws in the system where, like, ooh, if I was an engineer, would I design it that way? Or these are things that there's things it's weird because in some ways, if you study science, it doesn't matter what science it is. You know, you could, if you study astronomy, you're going to be in awe of nature. You could be completely secular to my mind. And I think a lot of, you know, you could probably talk to some, I mean, there are people have believe or don't believe for various reasons, but I think, you know, even a complete atheist science is in awe of creation and in nature. You know, they can see that it is a marvelous thing, regardless of how you think it came about.
Yep.
And you know, in actually taking the anatomy and physiology class, there was multiple times when we were going through. I still think about just, you know, the function of skeletal muscle and how thought becomes movement, and there are dozens of steps that have to occur in a microsecond for it to work smoothly. And the fact that it works at all, and that's just obviously one small function that the body does. The body's doing all these other things simultaneously. You know, we're breathing while we're moving. So there is kind of, regardless of your religious outlook, the more you learn about it, the more awe-inspiring, you know, and to me, that's quasi-spiritual, even if you're not, if you're, like I said, completely secular, the more you learn about nature and the world, the more you've got to kind of be in awe of it. And so, but yeah, that's just interesting. So that it's interesting to hear how you kind of keep those two. And are they constantly kind of, is there kind of a back and forth? Is it resolved, or is there tension? Is that kind of a dynamic process for you?
There's always tension. Someone's going to push back and bring up a question that I don't know the answer to. And I tell my students this all the time. I do not know everything. Please don't expect that I do. And it takes me to the research again. I have to look back and look into to try to figure out what direction that statement is leading. And was it, you keep using the word quasi-science or quasi-faith, you know, we're stuck kind of in the middle of those things. I like to put a lot of my support behind things that I can prove. You mentioned the whole concept of why do men have nipples, and this could be answered through embryology. I mean, probably the coolest, most difficult class I took, graduate level embryology, and it does explain why we have these structures. It's not an overlooked, oh wait, the engineer messed up kind of thing. It's actually there for a reason. And you might wonder, well, guys can't breastfeed. Well, yeah, actually they could if they had the right hormones, but because they can't get pregnant, they don't have the right hormones. Therefore, their milk glands don't develop the same way. We have milk glands. We could have been a girl, or we're not. And so the study of the embryology and how that single cell became this baby is a really neat study. It's going to challenge your brain. It's going to make you think about things in weird ways. But to see that we can explain away some of these things that people say are vestigial. That's that term that you're looking for, vestigial organs, organs that are left over with no function, that they do actually have a function. Your appendix has a function. It doesn't have the same function as a rabbit because we don't eat as many plant foods as a rabbit does, but it still has a function. And if you're wondering, it makes white blood cells and helps keep your large intestine from getting too infected.
Excellent. So, and I was going to say too, as far as, do you think it's just, and I feel like this is becoming much more of a philosophical podcast all of a sudden, but since I don't think, I think that still, I think our listeners would enjoy it. Isn't the whole, do you think is it even right to pursue saying I need to have hard facts, like I need to have the historical proof and the scientific proof, when the whole idea is faith to begin with? Like it's part of it is a belief in something. You know, like ultimately, regardless of whatever your outlook is, there are things like even science at a certain point will stop. Once, if you try to say, well, who started the Big Bang? Like science can prove all the way up to, but once you're like, well, what goes beyond that? There are certain questions that cannot be answered through the scientific method. You know, the whys or the what should I do kind of questions. I mean, maybe and granted, I'm getting quickly out of my depth here, but. And so in some ways, to have that faith of saying, okay, this is what science, I can accept everything that we can learn through the scientific method as this is the best we have as far as our best understanding of the physical universe. But there are certain questions that will never be within that realm. And so like, why do I need to, you know, is it even worth, like I said, I have faith that there is a creator or there isn't a creator. That is, that's ultimately kind of a personal, you know, like I said, belief or faith thing, something that
Definitely.
you're never going to find that proof And maybe that's a good thing. Like, you're never going to find it's always going to be a personal choice at some point.
And I think I have conversations in my car, either with myself or with whoever else is listening. And I giggle sometimes when we launch a new satellite and we find this new thing. And how cool is this new thing that we've never seen before? That's just it. We haven't seen it before. I think personally that God is up there laughing, saying, guess what I'm going to show you next? Because there's more out there. And we keep discovering new things. And when we start talking about these big things, astronomically, we can talk about the small things. I mean, think about what people used to think before there were microscopes. They didn't believe in germ theory. They didn't believe that bacteria caused disease. And that, of course, led to even more disease. So the more we discover, the more that we support the sciences, I think the more it reveals God's creativity and how amazing his creation is.
Yeah. And like ultimately it's, two people can look at the same thing and come away, I think you can be in awe of it regardless of how you think its origin came about. That like, that the universe, whether it's at the macro or the micro level, is something to be kind of in awe of and inspired by. And
Right.
so that's amazing. One thing I did want to touch on, and I thought it would have been an interesting topic for the coach to be, I'm going to kind of pivot here a little bit,
Okay.
was the topic of pain. Because obviously I said this is a martial arts fitness oriented podcast at times. And so mostly I should say, not at times. And so the topic of pain and what is pain? How do we perceive it? It came up very interesting. You had some very interesting perspectives for me in class, and I want to kind of talk about that. What is pain? What is the registering of damage to your body, and how is that different from pain?
One of the pivots I've had to do in the last couple of years is to reread the most recent research on pain. And most, not all, most physiologists won't even use the word pain anymore. Let's take that back. They don't talk about pain receptors anymore. They talk about nociceptors. And these nociceptors can sense damage to tissue. But if you think about this little kid who's swinging on a swing set and he falls off the swing set and parents freak out, like, oh, are you okay? Are you okay? Well, the kid's probably going to freak out. It's like, oh, okay. Or if the parents go, you all right? You got a little something on your knee, brush it off, go play. Then maybe the kid responds differently. Sure, what was there tissue damage? Maybe. How does that child respond to that tissue damage? It might be a learned behavior. Some people sense pain differently than other people sense pain. Oftentimes, we don't even know that we have pain until we actually look at it and go, ow, I cut myself. What did that happen? So pain it's subjective. A certain person can get a cut in a certain region, another person get a cut in exactly the same region, and they'll feel it differently. So this idea of nociception, or the sensation of tissue damage that we then apply to pain, we look at that in the realm of treating people who say that they're in pain. So you're in the hospital and someone complains that they're in pain. You can find no reason for their pain. Do you give them pain relievers? As the healthcare professional, do you give this person who says they're in pain relievers? And there is a strong movement now toward, yes, you give them pain relievers, even though you can find them no reason for pain. And some people will say, well, wait a minute, aren't they just drug seeking? Maybe, or maybe they're really in pain. And how are you going to then treat this person for the pain that they say that they're in, as you are the healthcare professional? So it's I don't want to say necessarily that it's new research, but it's evolving research and talking about how we perceive this tissue damage.
And what's interesting is, one thing through our training is that over time, your tolerance to pain changes. So something that hurt you before, once you're exposed to it repeatedly, all of a sudden, because a lot of our techniques and tactics take advantage of people's reflexes to pain. So but we also say there's always like a caveat saying, well, this person may not respond because they don't feel the pain the same way you do. So it's not, or they may be on something. If they're on, if the reason you're in a confrontation because they're on something, they're hopped up on something, they may not respond to a certain pain hold the way you're expecting them to. So always be, respect that. And it is interesting that, yeah, it is, like you said, subjective and individualized, that you're not going to get, everybody's body's different in a lot of ways. Um, but it is interesting that certain holds that are put on for us, the first few times, it's kind of like your mind freaks out. There's a panic, like you're kind of, you start to go into kind of like the brainstem mode where you're not thinking about, and that's part of what we're trying to take advantage of, is that we want the person not to be planning out what their next move is. We want them to be kind of just reflexively responding to something. But as repeated exposures happen, you start to be able to cope with it. And what is it that's changing that allows us, are we just developing physical calluses, so to speak? Or is there just kind of a mental conditioning saying, oh, this is okay, I'm not going to be, this is just pain, I can tolerate this, as opposed to being injured. And it is interesting to see how that changes as we go through that process.
Well, I think that certainly there's a psychological component to that. There is I've been in this position before, I know what's going to happen, I know what to expect. That's certainly that's going to play a role from a psychological perspective. But there's also a physiological perspective where we have these natural painkillers in our body called endorphins and enkephalins that they're opioids. They can actually relieve pain when the body is hurt, which is why when people who I was talking to one of my students last night, she likes to run for 4 hours, or sorry, 4 miles. I'm like, what? That's unheard of for me. 4 miles is what she's going for. I'm like, okay. And I said, you understand you're literally burning up your muscle tissue when you're doing that. And she says, but I feel good when I do it. I'm like, yeah, those are the endorphins. You're literally addicted to the opioids. And so now we're looking again, here we've got an athlete who goes to a hospital who needs anesthesia, but she's already got an addiction to the opioids that her body naturally produces. She may actually need more anesthesia to get her through that procedure. So that could tie into what you're discussing with your trainings.
Interesting. So do you think it's kind of the body more quickly begins to release those endorphins to say, okay, you've got to cope with, we're in situation A, we know we're going to be dealing with some pain here. So it starts to buffer that for us.
And I don't know if this term really applies here. I'm kind of going maybe out of my depth, as you had said, but the brain works on what are called pattern generators. And when you do things over and over and over and over, your brain kind of expects that to happen. So when you guys are doing trainings, I've never been through one of your trainings, it sounds horrible. I assume that you repeat, not only to make sure that the person that's doing the attacking knows what they're doing, but also so the person that's receiving that attack knows how to respond to that attack. So I think that both sides, both the offense and the defense, are learning from that. And I don't want to say this, it's not really a numbing, because I don't think that you're numbing anything. I think you're just getting those pattern generators in your brain to recognize this is what happened. Here's then how I counter that.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, there's the kind of, like I said, the technical way of countering, but there is also kind of the physiological, and like you said, psychological way of countering. Sometimes you're not going to get an immediate solution to it. If you're put into a certain problem, you might have to bear with it for X amount of time. And yeah, just being familiar with it helps. You say, okay, I've been here before, I've survived this, I know how to go through it. So I think, yeah, absolutely. There's whether you're on the defensive side, there's definitely like a learning process as part of that too, and development and conditioning. Kind of we kind of talk about it as being pain conditioning. Just like you have cardiovascular or muscular conditioning, you have to be ready. You have to be conditioned for impact and for pressure and all these other things that if someone's not used to it, very quickly they can panic. And you realize that the human body can handle a lot more than in modern life than we're used to. So it is interesting to see how that kind of correlates to some of the things you're talking about. But you're talking, and I was thinking about this too, about pain being at least partially learned, would you say? Or we don't know, it's still evolving, I guess. You said the research is understanding. Because I mean, obviously, we witness animals respond to pain. And are they learning pain as well, is the theory? Or is that, I mean, is it the reaction to the damage? Like, how is it different when an animal, did they talk about that at all?
And again, that's out of my depth. I am a human anatomy guy, I can make some hypotheses and say that sure, when there's tissue damage, that there are chemicals that are released. Those chemicals can cause discomfort, to let you know, hey, you might want to stop doing that because this is causing damage to your tissues, it's causing damage to your body. But I've never done the animal research to back up anything like that.
Okay, because that's always to me the comparison, and animals do learn too. Of course, they're learning as well as we are. Uh, but and I think we've all seen it, like you mentioned with kids, that if the parents freak out and panic, the kids will learn from that, and it'll kind of snowball out of control.
Sure.
So you're always trying to, like, at least when because I'm dealing with my nephews now, we had them wipe out a couple times in the last week. And you're just like, there's your initial reaction is to be like, freaked yourself. And you're like, oh, take a moment, take a breath and calm down, because they're going to see you freaking out.
Yep.
And that um, definitely can be passed on. So it definitely helps chill out the situation when you see that. Trying to think what else to talk about here. Normally, I really would have liked to have you meet Tony, because I think it would have been really interesting to talk about your perspective on the human anatomy and his on physical training, and kind of have you guys compare notes. But he's not here, unfortunately. What other things? Yeah, I think. Well, actually, I want to talk a little bit about your music. So one
Okay.
of the things we didn't talk on. So when did you? What kind of music did you get into? When did you get into music?
I would say from birth, always been around music. I mean, music of all kinds. Mom was always, I mean, 8-track tapes, reel to reels, everything was playing in the household. And it was always around. Music was always around. My uncle was, my dad, sorry, excuse me, my mom's brother was in high school musics. He was in their show choir. He played first trumpet. You know, he was a choir guy. He was always singing. And so when I got into high school, I mean, I did it in middle school too, but middle school is just kind of a feeling out area. But when I got into high school, I didn't even join the choirs until sophomore year, but I played in the band, I played trumpet, and just learning music. My junior year, or early senior year, my stepbrother wanted to get together a band. He wanted to put together a band, and my dad lived just outside the city limits, and so we used to play in the garage. You know, we his drum set, I got keyboards. We got a couple of guys. Got my stepbrother's best friends. They played guitar, so we would literally play in the garage. We were a literal garage band. We had the cops calling us so often. It was ridiculous. Like, we're in the country, for goodness sakes. Why are you calling the police on us? We played some gigs as some young kids. We went to, to Ottawa. We played this place, and multiple times. We played at the high school one time to close off a football game. That was kind of cool. That they had a little dance after a football game. That was probably our big thing that we did for the high school. And then when I went to college, that kind of fell apart. And the first week during orientation at college, a band got up on stage and started playing. It was just, it was just a bunch of freshmen, and these guys got up on stage and they were welcoming the freshmen, and they were playing a song by Night Ranger called "Don't Tell Me You Love Me." And as I'm going, I know this song. We used to play this song, and I'm listening to these guys. I'm like, but they don't have keyboards. I'm watching them, like, they don't have anyone playing keyboards. And so I stuck around after the gig was over, and I talked to them. I said, why didn't you have anybody play keyboards? Like, well, we don't have anybody play keyboards. I'm like, I play keyboards. And so I got together with these guys. This band never had a name. Kind of funny. We were together for like 3 years. We never had a name. One of the coolest gigs I ever did. We got a gig on Mississippi River, playing a riverboat for one of the college parties. And so we were going up and down the Mississippi River for a Saturday evening. That was just a really cool experience to do. And then, of course, that band fell apart with graduations and things. They were older than me, so they graduated and left. And met my wife, who is a very, very talented singer. And we were on, I mentioned earlier, praise teams at our churches. And we were now going to church in Yorkville. And we got a phone call from one of the guys that worked at the church. He said, there's a contemporary Christian band coming to Aurora, but their opening band dropped out. Do you know anybody who can sing? And this guy called our house and said, hey, you guys want to open up for Remedy Drive? We're like, yeah. So we got together, we threw together a band, and we played a couple of songs to open up for this contemporary Christian music group. And then a year later, we were asked to do our own gig. And so we had a 3-hour slot, and we got the Christian band back together. We did a couple secular songs, but it was mostly a Christian focused kind of a band. At the same time, my stepbrother calls up and says, "Hey, we're getting the band back together." What? So I'm singing, Christian music over here. I'm singing Ozzy Osbourne over here. I'm getting so confused about what I'm singing. Little Judas Priest over here, little Matthew West over here. It's like, whoa, okay. But it's just fun. I joke with the idea that I don't play keyboards. I play with keyboards. I don't play guitar. I play with a guitar. I've never been trained. I've never had music
Oh,
classes.
really?
It's
Interesting.
just, oh no, I just play. I play. I'm usually a lead singer. I call myself a bar singer. I would not definitely be on America's Greatest Talent of any kind, but I like to sing. And I'm not afraid to get up on stage and make a fool out of myself if that's what it takes.
That's a key factor, especially in rock music. You just want to be up there and be a fool. That's
I
how
never wore those pants.
So yeah, so you basically got a scientist, metal singer, Christian. I like that dynamic.
I cover a lot of pages, I think.
Um, yeah, so that's interesting because I was going to ask what instrument did you get into first? Kind of dialing back, was it the keyboards?
Probably piano. I think I had lessons for about half a year when I was in second grade, and I got bored, so I didn't want to practice. And then junior high, when it came time to start band, because again, my uncle played trumpet, I said, "Hey, I want to play trumpet," and so I started with that, and went back when Van Halen came out with 1984. They of course had the song called "Jump." And that was all keyboards. I'm like, I want to learn that. So I sat at my mom's computer, sorry, not computer, piano with my Walkman, my tape player, rewind, play, rewind, play, rewind, play to figure out how to play that song. And that kind of got me back into learning how to play the songs on piano. So if I can listen to it, now it's a lot easier with electronics. I can usually play it on the keyboards.
Interesting. That's kind of an interesting drill to go through. Um, I'm like the exact opposite. Like I need it spelled out for me. I need to be educated, explained to me. Like I don't have an instinct for it. I mean, I love music
Sure.
but you put a guitar in front of me, it looks like the inside, like I said, of a car or a computer. Or like I was like, this makes no sense to me. Some people immediately seem to be able to just look at what a guitarist is doing and understand what they're doing as far as forming
Yeah.
a chord. Like I need someone to lay it out exactly. No, you put your finger here, you strum this way, and I have to practice it very deliberately. So I'm always kind of in awe of people who have somehow learned just by like willing to play with it and figure it out. And
I'm
just
with you
like,
with guitar. I'm the same way with guitar. I've tried to learn guitar by online stuff, by just having people try to, my bandmates telling me this is what you got to do. I'm like, I can learn the chord progression, but can't apply it to anything else. So transpose that to piano. Piano to me makes perfect sense. Piano I can do anything with. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I'm not a pianist of any kind. Like I say, I can understand the methodology of playing the piano much better than I can the methodology of playing my guitar or playing my ukulele.
yeah. And it seems like piano is ground zero for a lot of like Western music. Like if you can understand that, you can take that anywhere, to transpose it to other instruments. It's kind of interesting. Your story is very much like one of my other nephews. He would always sit at the piano and would figure things out. Spend tons of time just listening to songs and trying to figure it out
Mhm.
on his own. The minute his parents would try to give him a lesson, he would just disappear. No way, I don't want to
Don't
have
want
any
it.
lessons. Or
Nope.
at that point, it becomes homework and work, and that doesn't sound like fun. So he was out of it. But he's actually still making music. So that's his mode of employment right now. So it was just part of him. So it's very cool. I think he did take some initial guitar lessons too when he was like about middle school age. He took it for a while, and he told me recently he actually had uh, he was actually writing music even back then. Like he said, he had thrown them out at some point. He really regrets it, but he had some initial songs where he was just trying to figure out, put the notes here, and this is what I want to do. Even before he really understood had any idea about music theory or how to write it down, he was writing
Sure.
songs. So it definitely was a part of his DNA from very early on. Um, that was super cool. I want to circle back to your teaching and kind of talk about teaching more in general, and kind of like what are some of your philosophies or ideas of how to approach teaching, how to engage a class, those kind of ideas.
I had the unfortunate realization that this year will be my 35th year of teaching in education. Yeah. And so, a lot of reflection going on in what I've done in those years. And one of the things I think that I really hang my head on is I want you to want to come back tomorrow. I want to have taught you something that makes you want to think, and what's he going to teach me tomorrow? And I think that if I can get you to want to come back, I can hopefully spark more interest in learning the topics that we're learning, not necessarily because I tell a cool story or I made a fool out of myself, something silly what I call it my dog and pony show, but because there's something in there about the how the human body works, because I find it to be absolutely freaking amazing how the human body works. And to put all those pieces together to function, I mean, you gave the example of just how muscle works, how the nervous system works with muscles to give any kind of coordinated muscle movement is insane. And then what happens when things go sideways? When one of those steps is out of place, now look at how the body is reacting and how it doesn't work the same way it used to. See, to me, that's the meat and potatoes. But you have to get the students engaged. You have to get them to buy into it. And that's one of the reasons why I do. You said about 20 minutes, that presentation I do the very first day about who this guy is and why I have any qualifications to stand up in front of you and teach you anything is to open myself up and say, hey, this has been my path. It has not been a smooth path. I was not the A high school student. I wasn't even the A undergraduate student. It wasn't until graduate school that I kind of figured out how to learn and figure out what I wanted to learn, because I actually wanted to learn it. And so when I was 10 years into teaching, I actually went back to school. You talked about being a non-traditional student. I was the oldest person in my class in graduate school by a lot. And so I'd gone back to school to get my master's degree. Now, most of my educational peers had gone back to school to get their master's degree in education. I didn't want my master's degree in education. I wanted my master's degree in a topic my students could use. And so I went back to get my master's in anatomy and physiology. And it turned out there were only 3 schools in the nation at that time that offered a master's degree in anatomy and phys, and one of them happened to be Northern Illinois University. And so that's what I was doing. The school I was teaching at gave me a year leave of absence to do a 2-year program.
Oh man.
And so I had to take summer, fall, spring, summer, then find out that I had some other classes that I had to take from undergraduate that I had never taken, like 100 level physics, and get that degree so that those questions my students were asking me, I could answer with more validity. Because they want, once they start buying into it, they'll ask you anything. I've gotten some crazy questions about the human body, and for the most part, I'm pretty confident with my answers. And if I don't know them, I also want them to know I don't know everything. I don't know that answer, but here's what I think. Here's where you might be able to find some more information. And so to be real to students, to not just be that guy who stands up there giving a lecture for 3 hours. I think that that's an important perspective, because you know how I start every single class. Any questions? And when I say any questions, I mean any questions. Now, the college students don't buy into that as much as the high school students do. And the high school students think it's a waste of time. That, oh, he's just going to answer some crazy questions. But when they walk away, I get feedback from them that's like, that was my favorite part of the day. That made me want to come back. And so now I've got you wanting to be in my class. I've got you perhaps engaging in my class, and maybe along the way, you're picking up the information that I'm hoping you're picking up.
Excellent. Well, it definitely worked for me. Like I actually had that vibe of it was. I enjoyed coming back to class. I was looking forward to whatever we were going to cover. Because I've had the spectrum of teachers. I think everybody has. And I've
Oh
had
yeah,
people just literally, which is unfortunate. When you see teaching done well, it kind of it's exciting, but it's also when you think about, gosh, if I had other topics would have been broached this way, who
yep,
knows? Who knows what could have happened with that? But definitely, so it's interesting to hear your perspective, and definitely works to keep people engaged. It's like, what is the fact I'm going to get now, or the interesting perspective I'm going to get this time? It definitely kind of inspired, because the class was a lot of work.
yep,
And I'm only halfway through, so I'm looking for part 2. But it definitely. I mean, either way, I would have wanted to do the work, and it was a subject I wanted to know. But regardless, it still was not. I think that would be I guess it's kind of a compliment saying that regardless of class, a lot of times it's like we have this for workouts too, where it's just like, oh man, I'd rather just not go tonight. Like, I'd rather just chill out, or, I just got done with work. So to actually have a class where it's like, no, this is, uh, yeah, I'm going to get something out of this, and I'm looking forward to what I'm going to be able to get out of this each night. So I was actually, yeah, like when there were times when, there was gonna be some scheduling conflict, and I was actually pretty upset about it, because I was like, "Oh, what I'm," because sometimes you just don't know what you're missing, and so, putting in the quantity time in that class is very important, and it was definitely something I looked forward to, so I think you're definitely achieving that goal. So,
Thank you.
and I think, and that's why I want to invite you on this, one of the reasons why I wanted to invite you on this podcast. I think, really engaging, a lot of interesting, like I said, you've got a very diverse, background and interesting life to share. And hopefully, we can have you back sometime, when coach is available. I think, down the road, revisit that. I think he'll enjoy listening to this podcast, and it'll probably spark questions on his mind. But I know you're super busy. You're going to start teaching again. It just starts right back up
Yeah.
for you. So, but it's great. Keep on doing the good work. Obviously, each generation, the teachers, again, it's like healthcare providers and teachers. But you're a teacher of healthcare providers, so you got the
It's
double
true.
win through. So, but thank you for making the time for joining. It was really cool talking to you again, and hopefully we will stay in touch. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Joe.